On a spring morning in South Africa, a newborn baby vanished from a hospital room. No ransom note, no witnesses, no trace. A mother lay in a hospital bed, exhausted but overwhelmed with joy. A father stood nearby, dreaming about the future. Their daughter had entered the world only days earlier. Everything seemed perfect. Then, in a matter of minutes, that perfect future shattered. How does a newborn disappear from a hospital filled with doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors? How can a baby simply vanish without anyone seeing what happened? And if someone took her, who were they? For years, those questions haunted a family, frustrated investigators, and gripped an entire nation. The case would become one of South Africa's most heartbreaking mysteries, a story of loss, hope, and a twist so unbelievable that many would struggle to believe it was real. Because 17 years later, the impossible happened. In April 1997, Christopher and Celeste Nurse were preparing to welcome a new chapter into their lives. Like countless expectant parents, they imagined first birthdays, school graduations, family holidays, and all the milestones that would shape their daughter's future. The birth of a child brings a unique kind of hope. It represents possibility, a beginning, a promise. For the Nurse family, that promise arrived at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town. The hospital was one of South Africa's most respected medical institutions. Patients came and went through its corridors every day. Doctors moved between wards. Nurses attended to newborns. Families gathered to celebrate new arrivals. It was a place where life began, and because of that, it felt safe. The delivery was successful. The Nurse family's daughter entered the world healthy and loved. Friends and relatives celebrated the news. Photographs were taken. Dreams were shared. Nothing about the coming hours suggested that a nightmare was approaching. But sometimes tragedy does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly. According to verified reports, a woman appeared in the maternity ward and gained the trust of people around her. Witnesses later recalled seeing someone who seemed to belong there. There was nothing immediately alarming about her presence. No raised voices, no obvious signs of danger, no warning. Then, somehow, the newborn baby disappeared. At first, confusion spread through the ward. Perhaps the baby had been moved. Perhaps another nurse had taken her for routine checks. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. But as minutes turned into panic, one horrifying realization became impossible to ignore. The baby was gone, and nobody knew where she was. The realization hit like a wave. Staff rushed through hallways. Questions echoed through the hospital. Doors were checked. Records were examined. Patients were interviewed. But every answer led to another question. How could this happen inside a hospital? What had security missed? And where was the child? The search began immediately. Yet with every passing hour, hope faced a new challenge. The trail was already growing cold. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, someone appeared to have vanished with a newborn baby. What nobody knew was that this mystery was only beginning. The answers would remain hidden for nearly 2 decades. And when the first major clue finally emerged, it would come from a place nobody expected. In the weeks following the disappearance of the Nurse family's newborn daughter, the story spread rapidly across South Africa. What had begun as a devastating personal tragedy was becoming something much larger. A nation was watching. People from all walks of life followed every update, hoping for a breakthrough. The details of the case seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A newborn baby had vanished from a hospital maternity ward, not from a crowded marketplace, not from a remote location, but from a hospital, a place where security, medical staff, and families were constantly present. How could such a thing happen? That question dominated conversations across the country. Newspapers printed photographs of the missing infant. Television stations covered the investigation extensively. Radio hosts discussed the case with listeners who called in with theories, concerns, and prayers. Parents looked at their own children and imagined the unimaginable. Many could not stop thinking about Christopher and Celeste Nurse. Every mother and father understood the fear, the helplessness, the agony of not knowing. As public concern intensified, investigators faced growing pressure to produce answers. Detectives worked around the clock. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Hospital procedures were scrutinized. Potential suspects were examined. Every reported sighting of a baby matching the missing child's description was investigated. For a while, it seemed as though the entire country had become part of the search effort. Tips poured in from every direction. Some callers believed they had seen the mysterious woman who had allegedly taken the baby. Others reported children they thought resembled the missing infant. Each lead brought renewed hope. Each lead carried the possibility that the nightmare might finally end. But one after another, those leads collapsed. A child in one town turned out not to be the missing baby. A witness in another city admitted uncertainty. A promising clue failed to produce evidence. The investigation repeatedly returned to the same place. Nowhere. The emotional toll on the Nurse family became immense. Every phone call raised hopes. Every police update triggered anxiety. Every promising lead carried the risk of another devastating disappointment. Yet despite everything, they refused to give up. They continued to believe their daughter might still be alive, somewhere, waiting to be found. As months passed, investigators confronted a difficult reality. The trail had gone cold. Without a confirmed suspect or reliable evidence pointing to the kidnapper's whereabouts, progress slowed dramatically. The case remained active, but breakthroughs became increasingly rare. For the public, the mystery became even more troubling. How does someone abduct a newborn and disappear without leaving a trace? How could no one know where the child was? And if the baby was alive, who was raising her? These questions lingered in the minds of millions. The case became one of South Africa's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. Years passed. The media continued to revisit the story periodically, especially on anniversaries of the disappearance. Each report reminded viewers of the unanswered questions. Each anniversary served as another painful milestone for the family. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. The missing child was growing older somewhere, but nobody knew where. Meanwhile, investigators continued to receive occasional tips. Most led nowhere. Some appeared convincing at first, but ultimately proved false. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Hope, expectation, disappointment. The pattern became painfully familiar. As time moved forward, many people began to assume the mystery would never be solved. Cold cases often remain cold forever. Witnesses forget details. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. And eventually, some investigations reach a point where answers seem impossible. The Nurse case appeared to be heading in that direction. Yet beneath the surface, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding. Far from police stations and newspaper offices, a young girl was living an ordinary life. She attended school. She made friends. She celebrated birthdays. She laughed, learned, and dreamed about her future. She had no idea that her life was connected to one of the most famous missing child cases in South African history. No idea that investigators had spent years searching for her. No idea that another family had never stopped hoping she was alive. Then, nearly 17 years after the disappearance, something happened that no detective could have planned. It was not a breakthrough in forensic science. It was not a confession. It was not a forgotten piece of evidence. Instead, it began with a simple observation, a resemblance, a similarity so striking that it caught people's attention. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, nothing more. But the more people looked, the harder it became to ignore. And soon, a question emerged that would change everything. Could the missing baby and this teenage girl somehow be connected? The answer would shock an entire nation. But before the truth could emerge, investigators would have to follow a trail nobody had ever expected to find. By 2015, nearly 17 years had passed since the disappearance of the Nurse family's newborn daughter. The case had survived where many others had faded away. It remained unsolved, a mystery suspended in time. For Christopher and Celeste Nurse, the hope of finding answers had never completely disappeared. But after so many years, even hope can become quieter, less certain, more cautious. No one could have predicted that the breakthrough would begin in one of the most ordinary places imaginable. A school, not a police station, not a crime scene, not a courtroom, a classroom. It started when Zephany Nurse, the younger daughter of Christopher and Celeste Nurse, enrolled at a Cape Town school. Like any teenager, she was focused on making friends and fitting in. But before long, people around her began noticing something unusual. There was another student at the school, a girl named Michelle Solomon. At first, the observation seemed harmless. The two girls looked remarkably alike. Friends noticed it. Classmates noticed it. Teachers noticed it. Some even assumed they were related. The similarities were difficult to ignore. Their facial features appeared strikingly similar. Their smiles seemed alike. Even their mannerisms drew attention. People who knew them often commented on the resemblance. At first, those comments were treated as little more than curiosity. Coincidences happen. After all, many unrelated people can share physical similarities. But the observations continued, and the questions grew louder. Why did they look so much alike? Could there be a connection? Or was it simply one of life's strange coincidences? For Cassidy, the comments became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The resemblance was undeniable, yet neither teenager knew the extraordinary mystery that surrounded their lives. Michelle Solomon had grown up believing she understood exactly who she was. She had a family, a home, a history. Nothing in her daily life suggested that her identity could be connected to one of South Africa's most famous missing child cases. But as people continued comparing the two girls, curiosity began turning into suspicion. The similarities extended beyond casual observation. Some individuals who knew the Nurse family's history found themselves asking an uncomfortable question. Could this somehow be connected to the baby who disappeared in 1997? The idea sounded almost impossible. After all, nearly 17 years had passed. Thousands of missing person investigations never find answers. The odds seemed astronomical, yet the resemblance remained. And once the possibility entered people's minds, it became impossible to ignore. The Nurse family became aware of the situation. Questions emerged. Careful inquiries followed. No accusations were made. No conclusions were reached. At that stage, there was only uncertainty, a possibility, a suspicion, a question waiting for an answer. The stakes could not have been higher. If the resemblance meant nothing, pursuing it could cause unnecessary pain. But if it meant something, if there truly was a connection, then the implications were almost unimaginable. Investigators eventually became aware of the concerns. What began as casual observations now demanded closer examination. The situation required facts, not assumptions, not rumors, not speculation. Only evidence could determine whether the resemblance was meaningful or merely coincidental. As authorities quietly began looking into the matter, emotions intensified on every side. For the Nurse family, old wounds that had never fully healed suddenly reopened. Hope returned. But hope can be dangerous, especially when it follows years of disappointment. What if they allowed themselves to believe, only to suffer another heartbreak. For Michelle Solomon and her family, there were questions that had never been asked before. Questions about identity, questions about the past, questions that would soon become impossible to avoid. Yet at this stage, nobody knew the truth. The mystery remained intact. Two families stood on opposite sides of a possibility that seemed too extraordinary to be real. A possibility that had begun with nothing more than a resemblance between two teenage girls. But now, science would have to provide the answer. Investigators knew there was only one way to determine the truth. One test, one comparison, one result that would either end the speculation forever or rewrite 17 years of history. Samples were collected. The process began. And as everyone waited for the results, a single question hung over the investigation. Was this merely a coincidence? Or had South Africa's most famous missing baby finally been found? The answer was sitting inside a laboratory, and when those results arrived, they would change lives forever. For nearly 17 years, the disappearance of the Nurse family's newborn daughter had remained one of South Africa's most heartbreaking mysteries. Investigators had followed leads. Families had endured unimaginable pain. Hope had risen and fallen countless times. And now, everything rested on a scientific test. Inside a laboratory, DNA samples were being analyzed. The process itself was routine. The consequences would be anything but. For the people involved, the waiting felt endless. There was no way to predict what the results would reveal. Perhaps the resemblance between Zephany Nurse and Michelle Solomon was merely a coincidence. Perhaps all the speculation would come to nothing. Or perhaps the impossible was about to become reality. As the analysis continued, emotions ran high. The Nurse family found themselves confronting feelings they had spent years trying to manage. Hope returned, but so did fear, because hope carries risk. After 17 years of unanswered questions, another disappointment could be devastating. At the same time, Michelle Solomon faced uncertainty unlike anything she had ever experienced. The life she knew suddenly felt fragile. Questions about identity began emerging before any answers existed. What if the rumors were wrong? What if they were right? What would either outcome mean? Then the results arrived, and everything changed. The DNA evidence confirmed that Michelle Solomon was, in fact, the biological daughter of Christopher and Celeste Nurse. The missing baby had been found. 17 years after disappearing from a hospital maternity ward, the child at the center of one of South Africa's most famous cold cases was alive. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. A mystery that had endured for nearly 2 decades had suddenly been solved. For the Nurse family, the moment was overwhelming. The daughter they had searched for all those years was real, alive. Not a memory, not a photograph, not an unanswered question. A living person. The emotions were almost impossible to describe. Joy, relief, disbelief, gratitude, shock, all arriving at once. For years they had imagined this moment. Now that it had arrived, it felt almost unreal. Yet the discovery was not a simple happy ending. Far from it. Because while one family had found a daughter, another family faced a devastating revelation. Michelle had spent her entire life believing she belonged to the family that raised her. Those relationships were real. The love she experienced was real. The memories were real. But now she was being told that her biological identity was something entirely different. Imagine learning that the story of your life is not what you believed. Imagine discovering that your name, your history, and your understanding of yourself are connected to a mystery that began before you could remember. The emotional impact was enormous. For Michelle, the revelation created questions that no DNA test could answer. Who was she? Where did she belong? Could she be both the daughter who had been raised by one family and the child who had been lost by another? Those questions had no easy answers. Across South Africa, people followed the developments with fascination and empathy. The discovery felt extraordinary, almost unbelievable. A missing baby found nearly 17 years later because of a resemblance noticed at school. It sounded like the plot of a film, yet it was real, verified by science, confirmed by evidence, and behind the headlines were human beings trying to process a reality none of them had expected. As the public celebrated the breakthrough, investigators turned their attention to another critical question. If Michelle Solomon was the missing child, then how had she ended up living under a different identity for 17 years? The DNA results had solved one mystery, but they had exposed another. Who had taken the baby from the hospital? How had the abduction been carried out? And how had it remained hidden for so long? The answers would soon lead investigators toward the woman who had raised Michelle, a woman who insisted she loved the child, a woman whose actions were now under intense scrutiny, a woman who would soon find herself at the center of a criminal investigation. The missing baby had finally been found, but the search for justice was only beginning. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery of the missing baby had existed as a question. Now, it is becoming a criminal case. The discovery that Michelle Solomon was actually Zephany Nurse had transformed the investigation overnight. What had once been a cold case buried in police files was suddenly one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in South Africa. The public wanted answers, not theories, not speculation, answers. Investigators now focused their attention on the woman who had raised Zephany since infancy, Lavona Solomon. Authorities alleged that she was the woman responsible for taking the newborn baby from Groote Schuur Hospital in April 1997. The allegations were serious. The emotional weight of the case was immense, and the evidence would soon be tested in court. In 2015, Lavona Solomon was arrested and charged in connection with the kidnapping. The arrest sent shockwaves throughout the country. For years, the case had seemed unsolvable. Now, there was finally a suspect standing before the justice system. As preparations for trial began, journalists filled courtrooms. News crews waited outside. Members of the public followed every development. The story had become far more than a criminal investigation. It was a national conversation about family, identity, and justice. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors worked to reconstruct events that had occurred nearly 17 years earlier. That challenge was enormous. Time complicates every investigation. Memories fade. Witnesses become harder to locate. Evidence becomes more difficult to verify. Yet prosecutors argued that the facts painted a clear picture. According to evidence presented during the trial, Lavona Solomon had allegedly posed as someone who belonged in the hospital environment before leaving with the newborn child. The prosecution argued that the child was then raised under a different identity for nearly 17 years. Throughout the proceedings, the court heard testimony from witnesses connected to various stages of the investigation. Evidence was examined carefully. Timelines were reviewed. Questions were asked repeatedly. The stakes could not have been higher. For Christopher and Celeste Nurse, every day in court reopened painful memories from 1997. The disappearance, the years of uncertainty, the endless search. Now they sat in a courtroom listening as the events that had changed their lives were dissected in detail. For Zephany, the experience carried a different burden. The legal proceedings focused on events that had shaped her entire existence. Yet she had been a baby when the crime occurred. She had played no role in what happened. And still, the consequences touched every aspect of her life. As the trial continued, attention remained fixed on one critical question. Could prosecutors prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's arguments. As in any criminal trial, The court's responsibility was not to rely on emotion. It was to evaluate evidence, facts, testimony, the rule of law. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was intense. Many people believed they already knew what the verdict should be. Others urged patience until all evidence had been heard. The atmosphere remained tense. Each day brought new headlines. Each hearing attracted fresh attention. And with every development, the country moved closer to a conclusion that had taken nearly 2 decades to reach. Finally, after hearing the evidence, the court delivered its decision. Lavona Solomon was found guilty of kidnapping and related offenses connected to the disappearance of Zephany Nurse. The verdict marked a historic moment in one of South Africa's most extraordinary criminal cases. For the Nurse family, it represented a measure of justice after years of uncertainty. It did not erase the pain. It did not restore the lost years, but it acknowledged that a crime had occurred and that someone had been held accountable. The court later sentenced Lavona Solomon to imprisonment. The legal chapter of the case was drawing to a close. But for the families involved, the story was far from over. Court verdicts can resolve criminal responsibility. They cannot resolve every emotional wound. They cannot answer every personal question. And they cannot instantly rebuild relationships affected by years of separation. When the cameras eventually left and the headlines began to fade, everyone connected to the case faced a new challenge. How do you move forward after discovering that your life story is not what you believed it to be? How do families rebuild trust after 17 years? And what does healing look like when there is no roadmap to follow? Those questions would define the next chapter. Because while the courtroom had delivered a verdict, life after the verdict would prove far more complicated. When the verdict was delivered and the courtroom doors finally closed, many people assumed the story had reached its conclusion. The missing baby had been found. A suspect had been convicted. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. But real life does not end when a judge leaves the bench. For the people at the center of this extraordinary case, the most difficult chapter was only beginning. Because finding the truth and living with the truth are two very different things. For Zephany Nurse, the discovery had transformed every aspect of her identity. For 17 years, she had known herself as Michelle Solomon. That name was connected to her memories, her friendships, her childhood, her sense of self. Then, almost overnight, she learned that she was also Zephany Nurse, the child whose disappearance had captivated a nation. Most people spend their lives gradually learning who they are. Zephany faced the challenge of rebuilding that understanding all at once. The questions were enormous. How should she view her past? How should she define her future? Could she embrace her biological identity without rejecting the life she had always known? There were no simple answers, only difficult emotions. For Christopher and Celeste Nurse, the years after the discovery brought a mixture of happiness and heartbreak. Their daughter was alive. That fact alone was extraordinary. For nearly 2 decades, they had lived with uncertainty. Now they finally had certainty. Yet certainty came with its own challenges. The daughter they had found was no longer a baby. She was a young woman with her own experiences, relationships, memories, and perspectives. Building a relationship would require time, patience, trust. No reunion, no matter how emotional, could instantly replace 17 years of absence. Relationships are built through shared experiences, and those experiences had been lost to time. The Nurse family understood that healing would be a journey rather than a single moment. One step at a time, one conversation at a time, one memory at a time. Meanwhile, public interest in the case remained intense. People around the world continued discussing the extraordinary circumstances that had led to the reunion. Many focused on the miracle of finding a missing child after 17 years. Others reflected on the emotional complexity of the situation. The story challenged simple ideas about family. It forced people to think about identity in a deeper way. Biology mattered, but so did experience. So did love. So did the bonds formed through years of shared life. The case became a reminder that human relationships are often more complicated than legal definitions or newspaper headlines. For Zephany, navigating those realities required tremendous strength. She found herself connected to two different histories, two different worlds, one rooted in her biological origins, the other rooted in the life she remembered. Neither could simply be erased. Neither could be ignored. As time passed, those closest to the situation increasingly emphasized compassion. The circumstances were extraordinary. The emotions were real. And healing required understanding from everyone involved. The story also left a lasting impact on South Africa. The case prompted conversations about hospital security, missing children investigations, and the importance of modern forensic science. Many people reflected on how a simple observation, a resemblance noticed at school, had eventually led to answers. Had those similarities gone unnoticed, the truth might never have emerged. That possibility remained astonishing. A mystery that had survived for nearly 17 years had been solved, not through a dramatic confession or a hidden piece of evidence, but through human observation and scientific confirmation. Yet even with the mystery solved, some questions could never be fully answered. What was life like during those lost years? What moments would have been different had the kidnapping never occurred? How might everyone's lives have unfolded under different circumstances? Those are questions that no court can answer. No investigation can resolve it, and no amount of evidence can fully explain. As the years moved forward, those affected by the case continued the difficult work of rebuilding, reconnecting, and redefining their futures. The legal battle had ended. The search had ended. But the emotional journey continued. Because some discoveries do not provide closure. Instead, they open the door to a new reality, one that must be understood, accepted, and lived. And for Zephany Nurse, that reality would forever be shaped by a truth that remained almost impossible to comprehend. She had been lost. She had been found. But what came after being found was a story all its own, and it raises one final question. After a stolen childhood is recovered, what does it truly mean to come home? Some stories end with a verdict. Others end with a reunion. But the story of Zephany Nurse refuses to fit neatly into either category. Because this was never simply a story about a crime. It was a story about what happens when truth arrives years too late. For 17 years, Christopher and Celeste Nurse lived in the shadow of a question. Every birthday, every holiday, every family photograph carried the weight of absence. Somewhere, their daughter existed. They believed it. They hoped for it. They prayed for it. But hope can be both a gift and a burden. It keeps people moving forward when logic says they should stop. It keeps a light burning in the darkest moments. And yet, it also prevents certain wounds from ever fully closing. For nearly 2 decades, they existed between grief and hope, never able to completely embrace either one. Then came the answer they had waited for, not in the form they expected, not at the time they expected. But it came. The child they lost was alive, and in that moment, one of South Africa's greatest mysteries was solved. Yet the truth carried a complexity that no one could have anticipated. Because while the Nurse family found their daughter, Zephany found herself facing a different kind of loss. Most people inherit their identity slowly, piece by piece. Family stories, photographs, memories, traditions, the knowledge of where they come from. But Zephany's understanding of herself changed almost overnight. The foundation beneath her life shifted. The story she believed was hers suddenly expanded into something much larger. And perhaps that is what makes this case so deeply human. It reminds us that identity is not a single thing. It is not only biology. It is not only memory. It is not only the people who raise us. Identity is the complicated intersection of all those things. It is where our past meets our present, where our origins meet our experiences, where truth meets emotion. The discovery answered a mystery, but it also created new questions. Questions about belonging, questions about family, questions about how a person can honor one part of their life without rejecting another. Those questions do not have easy answers. Perhaps they never will. And maybe that is why this story continues to resonate with people around the world. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the court case, beneath the extraordinary circumstances, there is something universally recognizable. The desire to know who we are. The desire to know where we belong. The desire to understand our own story. The passage of time plays a strange role in cases like this. We often imagine that time heals all wounds, but time can also deepen them. It can magnify the moments that were lost. The birthdays never celebrated together. The school plays never attended. The conversations that never happened. No court ruling can return those moments. No investigation can recover those years. Some losses remain beyond the reach of justice. And yet, despite everything that was lost, there is also something remarkable in what was found. Truth. After 17 years of silence, uncertainty, and heartbreak, the truth emerged. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because truth has a way of surviving, hidden beneath years of confusion, waiting beneath layers of time, refusing to disappear. For families of missing children around the world, that reality carries a powerful message. Hope may be fragile, but it is not always misplaced. Some mysteries remain unsolved forever. Others wait decades before revealing themselves. And sometimes, against every expectation, the answers finally come. Yet answers alone do not create healing. Healing is slower, messier, more personal. It unfolds in conversations, relationships, forgiveness, and understanding. It happens long after the cameras leave, long after the headlines fade, long after the world moves on to another story. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Zephany Nurse case. Family is more complicated than blood and more enduring than circumstance. Love cannot erase tragedy. Truth cannot restore lost time. Justice cannot repair every wound. But even after unimaginable loss, human beings possess an extraordinary ability to rebuild, reconnect, and rediscover one another. As we reflect on this remarkable story, we are left with an image that feels almost impossible to comprehend. A newborn baby carried out of a hospital room, a family searching for answers across 17 long years, and a young woman discovering that her life began with a mystery she never knew existed. It is a story about loss, a story about hope, a story about identity, and above all, a story about the enduring human search for truth. Because sometimes finding the truth does not bring an ending. Sometimes it simply begins a new chapter. And as the years continue to pass, one question remains suspended between the past and the future, between what was taken and what was found, between the family we are born into and the family we become. Can a stolen childhood ever truly be returned? Or does the truth create a new kind of mystery? Thank you for watching Hidden Truth African. Stories like this remind us that truth can remain hidden for years, sometimes even decades, before finally coming to light. Behind every mystery is a real person, a real family, and a story that deserves to be remembered. If this documentary moved you, shocked you, or made you think differently about the world around you, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Every subscription helps us continue uncovering extraordinary true stories that history nearly forgot. Here at Hidden Truth African, we bring you the most compelling true crime investigations, unsolved mysteries, disappearances, shocking criminal cases, and remarkable real-life stories from Africa and around the world. Join us on our journey as we uncover hidden truths, expose forgotten mysteries, and tell the stories that deserve to be heard. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. Subscribe now, because the next mystery is already waiting to be uncovered.